It was an ordinary afternoon at a local park, the kind of place where families gather, kids run freely, and the world seems to move at a slower, peaceful pace. The sun was high, casting long shadows, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter. But amidst this calm, something shocking was about to unfold, a moment that would leave everyone who witnessed it in disbelief. A young black boy, no older than 12, was playing in the park. His eyes sparkled with joy, his sneakers scuffing against the gravel as he ran with a ball in his hand. Little did he know that this simple afternoon would soon take a dark turn. A police officer, a figure meant to protect, patrolled the area, his dog by his side. The dog, a powerful and trained German shepherd, walked quietly by his side, its eyes alert. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, seemed to be watching the crowd with suspicion. For reasons unclear, he spotted the boy. Maybe it was the boy's sudden movements, maybe something else. But in a moment that would forever change the boy's life, the officer issued a chilling command. "Go," he said, pointing toward the boy. "Bite him." The dog, trained for protection and aggression, immediately charged toward the boy. The shock in the boy's face was immediate. Fear, confusion, and a desperate attempt to flee filled his every step. His heart raced, his legs frozen in the face of a situation he couldn't comprehend. The dog lunged, teeth bared, and the boy's body tensed. But in that moment of terror, he heard a voice that would save him, a voice that cut through the chaos. "Stop." The officer paused, the command hanging in the air, his dog momentarily frozen. And then, out of nowhere, a man stormed toward the scene. Tall, confident, his stride unwavering, he was someone no one had expected. This man wasn't just any stranger. He was the boy's father, a figure with authority, someone who had connections most people didn't. He wasn't just any man, he was a police captain. The officer stood still, his eyes widening in recognition. The boy's father was no one to take lightly. What had started as a shocking and terrifying moment for the child now seemed to be turning into something much more complicated. But what really happened that day? Was it a case of overzealous policing, or was there something more to this encounter than met the eye? The tension in the park was palpable as the boy's father confronted the officer, the dog still at his side, the fear in his son's eyes clear for all to see. The crowd that had gathered was now caught in a whirlwind of uncertainty. What happened next, and how did this seemingly random moment unfold into a story that would have the entire city talking? Stay tuned, because the answers may not be what you expect. This story is far from over, and what happens next could change everything. As the boy's father approached, the tension in the park thickened. The crowd, which had moments before been oblivious to the unfolding drama, now watched in stunned silence. The officer's hand was still gripping the leash, the dog's muscles tensed and ready to spring, while the boy stood frozen, terror in his eyes. The father's voice echoed through the air, sharp and commanding. "Why did you give that order?" he demanded, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. The police captain's tone was calm, but filled with authority. He wasn't just any parent confronting a cop. He was a man used to handling high-stakes situations, someone who had seen the best and worst of law enforcement. The officer hesitated for a moment, his face showing a flicker of recognition. His lips tightened, and he seemed to be weighing his options. The dog growled softly, sensing the shift in energy, but the officer's hand tightened on the leash, pulling the dog back. It was clear that this was no simple misunderstanding. This was about power and control. And in that moment, the officer realized he had underestimated the father standing in front of him. I thought the boy was doing something wrong," the officer stammered, clearly rattled by the unexpected turn of events. He glanced nervously at the growing crowd, the murmurs of confusion and disbelief spreading through the onlookers. "I saw him acting suspiciously. He shouldn't have been in that area alone." The boy's father didn't flinch. "Suspiciously," he repeated, a trace of disbelief in his voice. "He's a child, not a criminal. Do you treat every young black boy in this park like a threat?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and biting. The officer's face reddened. "I didn't," he began, but the captain cut him off. "No, you didn't think at all, did you? You just assumed." The father's words were clipped, controlled, but they carried the weight of years of experience. Years spent fighting systemic injustice, both inside and outside of the police force. He had seen this kind of treatment before, but this time, it was his own son at the center of it. The anger in his chest burned hot, but his voice remained steady. He wasn't about to let this moment slip by. The dog, still growling softly, shifted its weight as if sensing the growing tension between the two men. The officer tugged the leash again, trying to pull the dog back, but it remained fixated on the boy. The park had gone eerily quiet now, everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The boy's heart was still racing, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. His father's arrival had been a relief, but it didn't make the fear go away. He looked up at his dad, seeing the calm control in his face, but still feeling the weight of the officer's command in his chest. He wanted to say something, to ask questions, but the words stuck in his throat. What was going on? Why had the officer treated him this way? Why had he targeted him? His father knelt down next to him, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, son?" he asked, his voice low, filled with concern. The boy nodded, but his eyes stayed locked on the officer and the dog. He couldn't shake the image of the dog lunging at him, its sharp teeth bared. The thought of what could have happened was enough to make his stomach twist. The officer, realizing he had no immediate way out of the situation, shifted uncomfortably. He opened his mouth as though to apologize, but the words never came. Instead, he stood there, silent, unsure of how to handle the confrontation. The boy's father, a man who had spent years in law enforcement, knew exactly what the officer was thinking. The officer wasn't just embarrassed, he was trapped. This wasn't a simple mistake. It was a moment that spoke to a deeper issue, one that ran through the very core of the justice system. The boy's father turned his gaze from the officer to the onlookers, who were still standing around, watching in stunned silence. He saw the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty, and the judgment. He knew that some of them were silently questioning if he was overreacting, or if his son had done something wrong. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, and it was clear that, even though the officer had made a misstep, there was still an underlying belief in the system that this kind of treatment was justified. "Let me make something clear," the father said, his voice carrying authority. "What happened here today is not okay. No child, especially a black child, should be treated like a criminal just because of the color of their skin." He turned back to the officer, his eyes narrowing. "You put my son in danger today. You used a weapon, a trained dog, and gave an order without thinking. You didn't just threaten him, you violated him." The officer stood frozen, unable to respond. He had been trained to handle situations like this with a calm demeanor, but the captain's words hit him harder than anything else. The shame was beginning to settle in, but there was also a flicker of anger. Anger at being called out, at being made to confront the ugliness of his actions. The boy's father took a deep breath, his hand still resting on his son's shoulder. "I'm not letting this go," he said, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "This needs to be reported. It needs to be addressed." The officer's face hardened. "You think I'm just going to let you walk away from this without consequences?" He shot back, his voice suddenly defensive. "You're making a scene over nothing. Your son wasn't hurt. Nothing happened." "Nothing happened." The captain's voice rose slightly. "Nothing happened because I was here. But that doesn't change what you tried to do. You didn't just put my son at risk, you threatened him. You assumed he was guilty before you even knew him." The officer's face twisted with frustration, and for a moment, it seemed like he might escalate the situation even further. The crowd, sensing the building tension, began to murmur again. Some were clearly uncomfortable, others seemed to be in agreement with the father, but no one knew how to intervene. The father stood tall, unwavering, not intimidated by the officer's stance. His son was still by his side, and the boy was starting to realize something important. His father wasn't just a police captain. He was a man who would stand up for what was right, no matter who stood against him. But what would happen next? Would the officer face any real consequences for his actions, or would this be swept under the rug like so many other cases? And what would the boy take away from this experience, knowing that his father was part of the system that could sometimes fail him, and that the system might not always protect him in the way it should? The mystery of the officer's motivations, the truth behind his actions, and what would come of this encounter lingered in the air, unresolved. And as the father held his son close, the uncertainty of what came next weighed heavily on everyone. The park was still, the once bustling playground now a ghostly silence. The father stood between the officer and his son, the tension palpable in the air. The crowd that had gathered watched from a distance, unsure of how to react. Some whispered among themselves, exchanging glances, their eyes darting between the two men. It wasn't just about a police officer and a parent anymore. It was about a deeper, unspoken issue that had been simmering for years. The boy's father could feel the weight of it all, the stares, the judgments, the expectations. The officer, still clutching the leash of his dog, shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the boy's father to be so powerful, to be so unyielding. In his mind, he had followed procedure. His training told him to be vigilant, to keep an eye out for anyone who might pose a threat. And the boy had acted oddly. Too much energy, too much movement, a situation that didn't feel right. But the officer had missed something deeper. He had missed the humanity of the situation. The boy's father was no longer just a man confronting an officer. He was a man who had spent his career in the very same uniform as the officer. He knew how the system worked, he knew its flaws, and he had seen it from every angle. But seeing his own son, a child of color, on the receiving end of this kind of treatment, he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't allow the officer to walk away unscathed. As the officer stood there, processing the situation in his mind, the father's thoughts raced. He had always known the dangers of being black in America, especially as a police officer. He had seen firsthand how black bodies were treated differently in the system he had sworn to protect. He had been taught how to approach situations with caution, with control, but he had also been taught to see the humanity in every person. And yet, here was an officer who had failed to see that very humanity in his own son. The boy had done nothing wrong, nothing more than being a child in a public space. But in the officer's eyes, he was already a potential threat. The boy, still standing beside his father, was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but now, as he looked up at his father, he saw a new kind of fear. Not fear of the officer or the dog, but fear of what this moment could mean. His father had always been his protector, the one who made everything feel safe. But now, in the heat of this encounter, the boy was beginning to realize that his father was just as vulnerable as he was. He wasn't invincible, and this world wasn't as fair as he had once believed. As the boy processed this, a small part of him felt a sense of betrayal. Why was the officer treating him like this? Was it because of the way he looked? Because of his skin color? It was a question he'd never had to ask before, but now it was an uncomfortable reality. He glanced back at his father, who gave him a reassuring look. But the boy knew that there was more at stake here than just his own fear. His father's entire career, his sense of justice, was on the line. Meanwhile, the officer's mind was racing. He hadn't meant for it to escalate like this. He had followed the training. He had done what he thought was right. But now, standing face to face with the boy's father, he realized that something had gone terribly wrong. It wasn't just about one moment or one decision. It was about a system that had conditioned him to see certain people as threats. It was about years of ingrained bias that he had never truly confronted. The guilt was starting to seep in, but there was also a defense mechanism at play. He couldn't admit to being wrong. Not now, not in front of his colleagues and the growing crowd. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. The officer finally muttered, his voice less certain now, his words faltering. "I thought he was doing something wrong. I just wanted to be sure." "Sure," the father repeated, his voice rising again. "You wanted to be sure my son was guilty before you even knew who he was." The father's anger was simmering, but it was controlled, like a fuse burning just beneath the surface. He was doing everything he could not to explode, but it was becoming harder to hold back. The officer swallowed, visibly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean it like that." "You didn't mean it." The boy's father took a step forward, towering over the officer. His presence was commanding, and yet there was a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. You don't get to say that after you give the order to sick a dog on a child. You don't get to brush it off like it's nothing. I've been in this line of work too long to know when someone's making excuses for their mistakes. The officer remained silent, clearly out of his depth. His training had never prepared him for this. It had never prepared him for a situation where the lines between right and wrong weren't so clearly drawn. The boy's father was a police captain, his own superior in many ways, and yet here they were in the middle of a standoff. The officer realized he couldn't back down, not with so many eyes on them, but he also knew he couldn't keep pretending that this was a routine interaction. There was no easy way out of this. The boy, still standing by his father's side, turned his attention back to the crowd. There were more people now. Some had been watching from a distance. Others had gathered after hearing the raised voices. A few of them had their phones out, recording the encounter. The boy couldn't help but wonder what they saw. Did they see the officer as a protector, doing his job? Or did they see a man who had crossed a line, who had let his biases take control? His thoughts were interrupted when his father spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. "You know, I've spent my whole life trying to change the way people see us, trying to fix a broken system." His voice was quieter now, almost reflective. "But sometimes it feels like I'm just putting on a uniform and pretending things are different. I can't fix the world, but I can try to make sure my son doesn't have to go through what I've been through. Not this." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The officer didn't respond, but the quiet seemed to stretch on longer than either of them wanted. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. The dog shifted again, pulling slightly at its leash, sensing the uncertainty in the air. The boy glanced at it one last time, and for a moment he wondered if he would ever feel safe in a park again. Would this moment, this terrifying incident, haunt him for the rest of his life? The officer stood there, unable to offer an answer, and the boy's father, still holding his son close, knew that this was far from over. It wasn't just about this encounter, it was about the countless others that had come before it, and the ones that would follow. The system wasn't broken by one mistake. It was broken by years of small, unnoticed actions that built up over time. This was just the beginning. The park seemed to grow quieter by the second, the tension in the air almost suffocating. The officer, now acutely aware of the eyes on him, stood frozen in place, his mind battling between his training and the uncomfortable truth that was beginning to seep in. He had made a mistake, and this wasn't something he could simply brush aside. The boy's father was no longer just confronting him, he was holding up a mirror, one that forced the officer to look at the ugly reality of his actions. The crowd, though still unsure of how to intervene, was starting to sense the gravity of the moment. Some had put their phones down, watching with bated breath, while others continued to record, their fingers trembling. The boy, still standing next to his father, couldn't help but feel small. He wanted to step away, to retreat into the safety of the crowd, but he couldn't move. His father's presence was the only thing anchoring him to reality, and yet it also reminded him of how precarious his situation was. He had seen his father handle crisis before. He had always seemed like someone who could control any situation, someone who could make everything better. But this time, there was no easy solution. This time, it wasn't just about handling an angry suspect or a complicated case. This was personal. This was about his father's own legacy, the way the system had shaped them both. The officer's eyes flicked nervously to the side, scanning the crowd, as if seeking validation, as if someone would tell him that he hadn't done anything wrong. But no one spoke. The silence was deafening, and the only sound was the soft panting of the dog, its focus still trained on the boy. The boy's father stood tall, his eyes narrowing as he watched the officer struggle. "I don't need an apology," he said, his voice low but steady. "What I need is for you to understand what just happened here. I need you to understand that this isn't an isolated incident. This is a symptom of a much bigger problem." He took a step closer, his presence imposing, but there was no aggression in his movements. It wasn't about power, it was about truth. This is about a system that has failed us for too long. A system that has conditioned you to see my son as a threat before you've even spoken to him. The officer swallowed hard, his gaze flickering down to the dog at his side. His hands were trembling now, and the dog, sensing the shift in his handler's mood, let out a low growl, its muscles tightening. The officer's grip on the leash tightened in response, but he made no move to command the dog further. The boy's father didn't flinch, didn't back down. His eyes were unwavering, like steel. In that moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. The officer, who had always relied on his position and his authority, was now second-guessing everything he thought he knew. The boy's father, who had spent his life fighting for justice, now had to reckon with the limitations of a system that had shaped his entire career. The crowd, once silent, seemed to be leaning in, holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The boy's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His chest was tight, his body still trembling from the earlier fear. The encounter with the dog, the officer's command, his father's arrival, it all felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't wake up from. But it wasn't a dream, it was real, and he was in the middle of it. His father was right there with him, but even that didn't make him feel invincible anymore. The fear he felt when the dog had lunged at him was still fresh, still vivid. And now, as his father stood facing the officer, the boy wondered if anything would ever be the same. Would his father be able to fix this? Would he be able to make it right? The officer's jaw clenched as he looked from the boy to his father, then to the crowd. It wasn't just about him and the boy anymore. It was about the larger implications of what had happened. Could he admit to his mistakes? Could he let the world see that he had failed? His mind raced with excuses, with justifications. But deep down, he knew that nothing he could say would undo the fear he had caused. As the moments dragged on, the boy's father made a decision. He took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and the officer. "You can't change what happened here today," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But you can change how it ends." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You can choose to do better, for my son, for every child out there who might be treated like he was." The officer didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the boy's father, but they flickered with uncertainty. He'd opened his mouth to speak but stopped short. His words felt like they were stuck, lodged in his throat. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but he couldn't. The truth had already been laid bare. The boy's father turned slightly, looking down at his son. There was a fleeting moment of connection between them, something unspoken, something powerful. The boy saw the anger in his father's eyes, but he also saw something else, resolve. His father was fighting not just for him, but for every child who had ever been wronged, every person who had ever been silenced. It was in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to become a police captain in the first place. But as the father turned back to face the officer, something shifted. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching, faint at first, but growing louder. The sound broke the tense silence, drawing everyone's attention. The officer's face grew pale as he glanced toward the road, the unmistakable wail of police sirens growing nearer with each passing second. The father's eyes narrowed, his instincts kicking in. This wasn't just about the officer anymore. This was about what might happen next. What would the rest of the police force think? Would they support the officer's actions? Or would this turn into something much bigger, a public confrontation that could spark a wave of questions and calls for accountability? The sirens were getting closer now, and the boy's heart skipped a beat. Was the officer calling for backup? Was he preparing to escalate things even further? The air was thick with uncertainty, and the crowd began to murmur, sensing that the next moments would determine everything. The officer shifted his stance, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to appear at any second. The boy's father stepped closer, blocking his view of the road, his expression hardening. He wasn't going to back down, not now, not when everything was on the line. The sirens drew closer, and with them came the looming question: what was going to happen next? Would this moment be resolved peacefully, or would it spiral into something much darker? The tension was unbearable, and in that instant, everyone present knew that the next few seconds would change everything. The sirens were blaring now, unmistakable, and the crowd seemed to hold its breath, watching as the officer's unease grew. The officer's hand tightened around the leash, and his gaze flicked nervously between the boy, his father, and the approaching sirens. It was clear to everyone watching that something was about to shift, something neither side was ready for. Then, just as the crowd braced itself for the arrival of backup, a sudden voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Step away from him, officer." The voice was familiar to the boy's father. It was a voice he had heard countless times, authoritative, steady, one that could silence a room with a single word. It was the voice of someone who didn't just carry the weight of a badge, but the weight of years of experience. The boy's father froze, his heart skipping a beat. A tall figure emerged from the crowd, walking steadily toward the scene. The man was dressed in a crisp uniform, his face calm but resolute. His gaze locked onto the officer, but there was no hesitation in his stride. The boy's father could feel the blood drain from his face. It was Asterisk, his superior Asterisk, a man who knew everything about the department, about the inner workings of the force. And more importantly, this man knew him. This man was Asterisk, his boss Asterisk. The boy's stomach churned as the realization hit. This wasn't just any officer. This was the very person who had mentored his father when he was starting out in the force, the one who had helped shape his career. But now, with everything on the line, the boy felt the weight of the situation growing heavier. What was going to happen now? His father had been fighting for accountability, for change. But the arrival of this man, the one who held his father's future in his hands, felt like a new, unseen danger. The officer, still holding the leash of the dog, visibly tensed when he saw who was approaching. His hands shook, but he didn't look surprised. He'd known the senior officer was on his way. There was a history between them, something unspoken, but it was clear that the situation had just shifted. The senior officer stopped just a few feet away from the boy's father and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that could have been interpreted as comforting if it hadn't felt so calculated. The boy's father didn't flinch, though. He kept his back straight, his eyes still locked on the officer. "What are you doing here?" the boy's father asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. "I'm here to ensure the situation doesn't escalate further," the senior officer said, his tone cool and even. "This is a delicate matter, and I don't think either of us wants to see things get out of hand." The boy's father clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of his old mentor's words. Asterisk, delicate matter asterisk. The phrase was more loaded than the senior officer knew. It wasn't about the situation anymore. It was about something deeper, something far more personal. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was a test. A test of everything the boy's father had worked for, everything he had fought to change. The officer who had ordered the dog to bite the boy looked at the senior officer now, his eyes darting between the two men. He wasn't sure if he had backing, if he was going to be protected, or if this moment would cost him more than he could bear. It was clear that he was out of his depth, and his previous bravado had evaporated. The senior officer's presence loomed over them like a storm cloud, ready to break. "I don't think you understand what's happening here," the boy's father said, his voice growing more firm. "This isn't about saving face or trying to look good in front of the crowd. This is about asterisk accountability asterisk. You want to protect him. Fine, but what about my son? What about the people who have been left behind by this system? Who's going to protect them? The senior officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced down at the dog, then back at the officer, who was still standing beside it, unsure of what to do. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The sirens outside were growing louder, but the world felt still, as if time itself had paused to wait for the next move. The boy felt a strange sense of dread begin to creep up his spine. He wanted to ask his father what was going to happen next, but the words stuck in his throat. This wasn't just a situation of right versus wrong. This was about power, loyalty, and the hidden structures that held everything together. The boy's father had always been someone who demanded respect, but he was also someone who understood the delicate balance of the system. But now, as the senior officer stood there, it seemed as though everything was teetering on the edge. The senior officer turned to the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces around them. There were too many people watching now, too many phones recording. This wasn't just an internal matter anymore. The world was about to see what happened when the system was forced to answer for its mistakes. "You're not getting away with this," the boy's father said, his voice low and dangerous. His words were as much a statement of intent as they were a warning. He had spent too long trying to change things from within, trying to work his way through the ranks. But this moment felt like it might be the breaking point, the moment that finally exposed everything. The corruption, the bias, the assumptions that had been allowed to fester unchecked. If they didn't do something now, nothing would ever change. The senior officer opened his mouth as if to speak, but then the unmistakable sound of approaching police vehicles rang out. The sirens weren't just getting closer, they had arrived. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing that the situation was about to explode. Everyone stood frozen, unsure of whether they should stay or scatter. The officer beside the dog looked visibly relieved as the backup cars skidded to a halt, several officers jumping out and rushing toward the scene. But the boy's father wasn't done. He locked eyes with the senior officer one more time, his voice trembling with the weight of everything he was about to say. "You want to protect this officer, fine, but let's see how far your loyalty goes when the truth comes out." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. The senior officer's expression faltered for a split second, but then he masked it with a cool smile. He wasn't about to let this unravel in front of everyone, but something told him this wouldn't end as easily as he'd hoped. And in that moment, the stakes weren't just about one officer's mistake or the boy's fear. It was about a deeper, darker truth that was about to come to light, a truth that could unravel everything, not just for them, but for everyone involved. The tension, once thick, was now unbearable. The next move would determine everything. The backup officers rushed onto the scene, their boots pounding on the pavement, their movements sharp and practiced. The crowd parted to make way, but the tension only grew, the air thick with anticipation. The boy's father didn't flinch as the new officers took their positions around him and his son. They could see the situation was escalating, but they were clearly waiting for direction. The senior officer, who had been standing quietly in the background, now stepped forward again. He nodded at the officers, his face unreadable, as though he were preparing to deliver an order. But then something unexpected happened. The boy's father wasn't waiting for anyone. He turned to the officer who had ordered the dog to bite his son, his voice low but unwavering. "You can't undo what you've done," he said, the words carrying a quiet but devastating weight. "But you can stop pretending it was okay. You can stop pretending that we haven't been watching." For a moment, the officer who had commanded the dog to attack seemed to shrink, his eyes flicking nervously between the boy's father and the growing number of officers around him. His hand tightened around the leash of the dog, but he didn't speak. The boy, still standing beside his father, watched the entire exchange with a growing sense of disbelief. His father wasn't just speaking out for himself anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been mistreated, misunderstood, or silenced. The senior officer, clearly agitated now, stepped forward, his posture tense. "We don't have time for this," he snapped, his voice tight. "This isn't the place for your personal vendetta. We'll handle this internally. But the boy's father wasn't finished. Asterisk internally asterisk, he repeated, his tone colder than ever. Do you really think this will be swept under the rug like every other time? He turned back to the crowd, his voice rising now, carrying out into the park. Look at this. Look at what's happening here. This asterisk is the system. This is what happens when people believe they can do whatever they want without consequences. The officers around him began to shift uncomfortably. They weren't used to seeing a fellow officer speak out like this. But the boy's father didn't care. His eyes never left the senior officer as he continued, his voice full of emotion and anger. You've protected this kind of behavior for far too long, and now... His words were cut off by a loud voice from behind him. Captain, step back. Now. It was the boy's father's voice that the crowd had heard only moments before, but this time the words weren't directed at the officer. They came from another figure, one who had been standing silently at the edge of the crowd, waiting. It was another officer, a woman who had been in the department for years, one who had always kept a low profile. The boy's father's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice rising. The woman, calm as ever, stepped forward. She was the kind of officer who had always avoided the spotlight, always did what was expected of her. But today, she wasn't backing down. She had a file in her hand, and it was thick with papers. The system is broken, she said simply, her voice steady. But we can't keep pretending it's not. There's no more sweeping things under the rug. She looked at the senior officer, her gaze unwavering. We have to fix this. Now. And I'm not waiting for your orders. The crowd gasped as the woman walked up to the boy's father, handing him the file. He took it, his heart racing as he realized what it meant. Inside the file were documents, reports, and notes. Everything he had suspected about corruption within the department, about the way certain officers had operated unchecked, and now it was all in his hands. The senior officer's face paled as he realized what was happening. You can't do this, he muttered, his voice low. You don't know what you're starting. But the woman wasn't done. The truth is already out there, she said. You just didn't think anyone would see it. The boy's father looked down at the file, his mind racing. The pieces were finally coming together. This wasn't just about his son. This wasn't just about one officer's failure. This was bigger, much bigger, and it had been going on for years. He could feel the weight of the decision now, the responsibility of what lay ahead. But there was no turning back. Is this what you wanted? The senior officer spat, his voice rising in anger. To ruin everything. To drag this department through the mud. Do you really think people will believe you? The boy's father didn't answer. He didn't need to. The moment was too powerful, too real. Then, unexpectedly, the dog, still standing beside the officer, let out a sharp bark, its attention now focused on something else. The officer's grip on the leash slipped, and the dog broke free, rushing toward the boy. The crowd gasped, and the boy's heart pounded in his chest. But before anyone could react, the boy's father stepped forward, his instincts kicking in. He moved in front of his son, his body blocking the dog's path. No, the boy's father said, his voice low but firm. Not today. But the dog stopped just inches away, its eyes focused on the boy, its breathing shallow and quick. The officer, his face twisted in disbelief, stood frozen as he realized what had happened. The dog, trained to follow commands without question, had hesitated. For the first time, the bond between man and beast had faltered. It was a small victory, but it was enough. The senior officer and the officer who had commanded the dog stood silently, the weight of their actions crashing down on them. Around them the crowd was silent, but the air felt different. There was a shift in the balance, a change that couldn't be ignored anymore. Let's go, the woman said to the boy's father, her voice soft but resolute. She nodded toward the officers who had now circled them, their faces blank, unsure of what to do next. The boy's father looked down at his son, his eyes softening for a moment. He nodded. We're done here. As they turned to leave, the officers stood still, caught between their duty and the weight of the truth. The boy's father had won, not just for his son, but for every person who had been pushed down, overlooked, or silenced by the system. But just as they walked away, the final twist came. The senior officer, his face pale, whispered under his breath, "You think this is over? It's just begun." The boy's father didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The truth had already begun to spread, and there was no stopping it now. The storm had arrived, and this time, it wasn't going anywhere. The boy, still clutching his father's hand, looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of reassurance. The streets around them were calm now, the chaos beginning to fade into the distance. The police vehicles had dispersed, but the tension still lingered. He could see the determination in his father's eyes, but there was something else there too, an exhaustion that had been building for years, a weight that couldn't be shaken off easily. They made their way to the car, the woman trailing behind them. As they got inside, the boy's father finally spoke, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "You did good today," he said, his voice rough but filled with pride. The boy didn't respond right away. He was still processing everything, the fear, the anger, the confusion. But in that moment, he knew his father had done something monumental, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. The woman, who had been a quiet presence throughout, sat in the front seat, her hands on the wheel. She turned to face them briefly, her expression calm, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "This is just the beginning." The boy's father nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "I know," he replied, "but at least now, we've started something. It's out there. They can't pretend it didn't happen, and that's a start." The drive home was long and quiet, but there was a feeling of accomplishment in the air. The boy's father had taken a stand, and though the road ahead would be difficult, there was a sense that the battle was far from lost. The truth had been exposed, and while the system wasn't going to change overnight, it had been shaken to its core. Weeks passed, and the story began to spread. News outlets picked up the footage of the altercation in the park, and the public outcry grew. The pressure on the police department mounted, and internal investigations were launched. The senior officer who had once believed he could get away with anything found himself under intense scrutiny, and the officer who had commanded the dog to attack the boy faced disciplinary action. But it wasn't just the officers who felt the consequences. The entire department was forced to reckon with its own history, the practices that had allowed abuse to fester unchecked for so long. For the first time, real conversations were happening, conversations about accountability, about reform, about the ways power had been abused, and how it could be changed. The boy's father became a reluctant figurehead in the movement. He hadn't set out to be a leader, but he quickly realized that his role had shifted. He had seen the cracks in the system long before this incident, but now he was in a position to do something about it. The boy, watching his father from the sidelines, felt a growing sense of pride, but also a deep awareness of the long road ahead. The fight was far from over, but now there was hope. At the same time, the woman who had handed the file to the boy's father became an integral part of the effort. She had been a quiet observer for years, but now she was speaking out, helping to coordinate efforts within the department to root out corruption and ensure that the changes promised weren't just empty words. Together, they built a coalition of officers, community leaders, and activists who were committed to creating a safer, more transparent system. It was a long and difficult process, filled with setbacks and opposition, but they kept moving forward. The boy, now fully understanding the gravity of what had happened, found his own voice. He spoke at rallies, telling his story, sharing his experience. His words resonated with people in ways he hadn't imagined, and he began to see the larger picture, how one act of courage, one refusal to remain silent, could ripple out and inspire others to take action. The boy's father, for all his strength and resolve, still struggled with the weight of the past. He had always known the system wasn't perfect, but seeing it exposed in such a public way forced him to confront his own role in it. He had risen through the ranks, built a career, and even earned the respect of his colleagues. But now he had to face the truth. That respect had been built on a foundation that allowed the kind of corruption he had always known existed, but had never fully acknowledged. It was a difficult reckoning, but it was also a necessary one. As the months passed, changes began to take shape. The department implemented new policies, officers were held accountable for their actions, and the community, once fractured, began to heal. There were still challenges ahead, and there would always be those who resisted change. But for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope. The boy's father had given everything to make a difference, and though it hadn't been easy, he knew that the future was now in better hands. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, the boy's father turned to him with a quiet smile. "You know, you were right," he said softly. "We're not done yet, but I think we've done something worth fighting for." The boy nodded, his heart full. He had watched his father fight for what was right, not just for himself, but for the people who needed it the most. It wasn't just about one moment of courage, it was about building something that would last. The road was long, and the challenges ahead were many, but they had already made a difference. And in the end, that was what mattered the most. The boy's father had set the course for change, and while the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, the journey had begun. Together, they had taken the first step toward a better, more accountable future, one where no one would ever again have to face the unjust realities they had fought so hard to overcome. The story wasn't over, but for the first time, there was hope that it would end differently, and that made all the difference.